Hello and welcome to the A-Form Show. My name is Alan George and thank you very much for tuning in. Each week, we sit across from thought leaders and change makers in the architecture and design space of the GCC. We dive deep into their experiences, both professionally and personally, and share their valuable insight as to what makes them tick. Our goal is to add value to your day and help you navigate your own personal creative journey. Finally, the opinions and the views of the guest speakers are that of their own. They do not necessarily represent the views and the opinions of the show or the host. Welcome to the show, everyone. Our guest today is David Daniels. David is currently the Director of Architecture at SSH UAE. David has been part of the success story of SSH UAE from the very beginning and has helped shape, quite literally, the design direction of the practice. This is reflected in SSH recently awarded works, both in Dubai and across the region. Prior to SSH UAE, David spent a significant amount of time with both Howells Architects and Hopkins Architects in London, wherein he refined his craft. Both practices are part of a much larger community in terms of their location and social context, which we're sure we're going to get into as soon as this starts. We're sure David would be able to explain it a lot better than we ever could. These roots have helped David envision a vital sense of social context in his work. After being part of SSH for close to 6 years now, it's safe to say that David has been able to create his own little piece of Marylebone right here in Dubai Design District. This can be clearly seen in one particular market segment that SSH specializes in. The cultural projects that come out of SSH UAE have gone on to receive multiple awards and acclaim from peers, and rightly so. We are super excited to have David with us today. So without further ado, let's begin. Awesome. Welcome to the show, David.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So I kind of want to dial it back because when we did research for your profile, it seems that these two practices, specifically Hopkins and GHA, I would not say that I know much about the location, but from whatever I do know of it, it seems like it would impact the sort of architectural master planning stance that you would have, just because of how they're located, where they are, and how they sort of operate. So I'm kind of wanting to start us off with, how did those practices sort of help you create your design ethos?
I think you're perfectly right there. I mean, they're both practices, very different practices, but seem to have a very similar outcome in their projects and the quality of their projects.
Right.
And I think that comes primarily from their principles, really, which have been set out by Glenn Howells and Michael Hopkins, and it feeds into their, for the want of a better word, their disciples around them. And I was very lucky to kind of be a part at a young age of both of those studios and kind of interact with the kind of the leaders of both of those studios as well. Because so exactly as you said, that's kind of, I would say, those two practices in particular really gave me my kind of outlook for what architecture should do in a societal and a contextual terminology.
Right.
The locations, I mean, both having offices in London. London's one of the greatest cities in the world. And I think that greatness comes from its longevity and the layers, the stratuses of development that have occurred and the lessons that have been learnt through time. And I think, any studio that kind of dwells in that location, it's not difficult if you have open eyes and open ears to
sort of take it all in,
to soak that up and, allow it to affect you. I think the other thing that's kind of very important about both of those studios and it's just something that's driven into us all the time, context aside, because that's a given as a good architect, urban designer for me, but the interaction with the community, it's something since I came to the UAE now 10, 11 years ago, it's something I still try and really push for when we do our projects. It's a little bit more difficult here,
right?
Because we have an abundance of land, which is great because it gives us opportunity, but it also makes that contextual driver and that kind of community driver a little bit more difficult to grasp, right? And a little bit more difficult to kind of implement into your designs, along with some other things which I'm sure we'll touch on, like speed of project and things like that. So yeah, so that social awareness is probably the key item for me that kind of I took from Glenn's and from Michael Hopkins. It's And it's a foundation for what we really do at SSH now. You know, we fight very hard. We don't always win, but we fight very hard to ensure that when we do begin a new project, you know, a clean project from the beginning, that we fully understand where we're going to be touching the ground. Because in my opinion, it's much easier to make a beautiful object and plant it somewhere than it is to tie it into the community.
True.
But I think, you know, the great buildings, those assets which help to drive a society forward are the ones that are far more aware of their location and of the people that they serve, as opposed to being a sculptural object.
Right.
It gets very grey and muddy sometimes when you kind of have to explain that to people sometimes. But for us, that's very, very, very important. And I think a lot of the kind of the youngsters that we have in the studio here, a lot of the younger team, we look very hard for that social responsibility in them when we interview and when we have a coffee with them to get to know them and that. And it generally is probably one of the primary things that we kind of look for when we're hiring people now.
Right. Right. Which is sort of interesting, because this kind of ties back into something we were sort of talking about just before the interview started, which was, given the current sort of market situation that we're in, we're sort of, I don't want to say post-COVID just yet, but we're definitely, it seems like we're into the second half of it. And it seems that the city of Dubai, because it's always ever been so fast-paced and so on, has finally got a minute to sort of, you know, take a step back and see what's actually happening, which then opens up the possibility for really good, purposeful, contextual sort of architectural design.
I'd stretch that to the whole of the UAE.
Okay.
I think, you know, projects we're working on in Abu Dhabi and Ras Al Khaimah as well, exactly that. I think, not the shutdown, because we never had a shutdown. We were great. I think the UAE handled the whole situation probably, for me, probably the best in the world. You know, we have friends in the States, we have friends in Europe, and the stories that come back from how it's kind of
dealt with there,
dealt with and still being dealt with, shall we say,
right,
is scary. It's very scary. Whereas here in the UAE, you know, I think the things that were put into place very quickly helped us, and I think that's going to help us from a built environment point of view. Exactly that, because I think what it has done is, it's given developers and it's given owners, you know, we touched upon, as you said before, you know, kind of the personal owners, not just the big money men developers.
Correct.
It's given them time to actually sit, think, reflect, and go, okay, is this actually the best thing for our communities? Is this the best thing for the UAE?
Correct.
And I think they've come out the other side with a slightly different attitude now to what they're actually developing, rather than develop en masse, pilot high kind of mentality.
Right.
There's actually now, how do we create something which is special and is going to set us apart from our competitors? Because let's be honest, the UAE has a great competitive market.
No doubt.
And I think it's now ripe for a change to actually now start adding some really unique developments, you know, really kind of schemes which set themselves apart from everything around them. And I think a lot of that will come out of the time that people have had to just sit and reflect and to think and to kind of search out new ideas and new opportunities in the downtime that COVID gave everybody.
Right.
So we're really excited about what's going forward. It's for me and the team, there's some really good opportunities out there. We just have to make sure that they get pushed through and completed. It's always the difficult thing.
Right. The only reason I sort of touch upon that is because it's well known that in other parts of the world, architecture practices, design practices don't generally run at the same pace that we tend to do over here.
Yeah.
So I guess my question to you is, is this the right time to sort of really bring in the sort of practices that these much older firms abroad use, and it's part of their DNA? Do you think now is the right time for firms here to sort of embrace that mentality?
I think firms here already embrace that mentality. The problem has been the speed. Look what the UAE's created, you know, in 50 years. It's phenomenal, and it's been sprinting all along. And I think a lot of that kind of sprint is always going to happen because it's in the DNA.
Right.
Run fast. I think what we have to do though, and it's more of a professional thing really, is be able to advise our clients who are our partners at the end of the day that it's not always the best thing for the end product to run very fast.
Right.
We all, I'm sure everyone listening to this, yourself and myself, all have experiences where we've gone at 1,000,000 miles an hour and yet we've had to do the scheme 5 times.
Right. Right.
So in the end, probably would have been a little bit quicker actually just to have taken the time at the beginning and got it right first time.
Yeah.
And I think, what we have to do as a profession is really push that fact to our clients that we can still go very fast and we can still deliver within their aspirations, beyond their aspirations. But sometimes, let's actually just spend the time needed to do the exercise thoroughly.
Right.
Rather than, let's look at this, copy that and push that.
Right.
We can do that in 3 weeks. And then you find actually, it doesn't work because it's not contextually sensitive. It doesn't work with the infrastructure. The market isn't correct for that particular approach.
Correct.
And then you have to go back and start again from the beginning and waste more fee and waste more energy and time and intelligence. So I think it's more for us as a profession to actually maybe bond a little bit closer together and have a unified approach. I've been very vocal, I think, since joining SSH nearly 6 years ago now. I still think as a profession, we aim at one another far too much. We don't come together as much as we really should. It's one of the things that I think, the community in London, in the UK, I'm not saying everyone's, hippie-like and get on perfectly well with each other, but we do come together as a community of designers and architects far better than I think we do here, where there's a lot more competition here, and that doesn't, for me, benefit anybody.
Right.
And that to me would be the thing I would love to see change as we come out of this most unusual of times.
So you would say that it doesn't necessarily have to be as, maybe collaborative is not the right word, but just more open in terms of knowledge sharing? Is that the kind of...
I think so. And communication, we're very lucky in Dubai and the UAE because we have a great collection of designers. And what I love about the UAE so much is the mixing pot. Everybody has a different way of doing it because they've got a different history behind them or a different kind of cultural context behind them, a different educational system.
Right.
We don't share that. There's just one way that, we do it our way, you do it your way, they do it their way.
Correct.
And your way sometimes, my way, isn't the right way for a project or for a client. And rather than trying to just steamroll that approach over someone, sometimes, and I'm very proud to say we've done it within SSH UAE, you've got to step back and just say to yourself, we're not right, and advise your client, actually, you know what, we think A, B, and C are more suited for this project.
Yeah.
But I don't, and in the UK, we would do that at Glenn's and at Michael Hopkins. We would do that. We would get briefs. We would have clients come to us. And if we felt we weren't appropriately experienced or sensitive enough or knowledgeable enough, we would help that client find the appropriate studio that was the right one for it. And generally that would then lead to some other sort of work for us to do on the project in a different manner. And so it's not like we're cutting ourselves short of fee or experience. It's just we always, had that social awareness as to the best for the greater.
It's a sentiment which now that, we're doing a lot more of, the podcast and so on, it's a sentiment which is shared by a lot of firms. And it just, for some reason, everyone knows that they should do that, but
it's just difficult to enact upon.
Exactly. And we keep trying to, tell the non-believers about, rising tide, lifts all boats. It's in everyone's benefit to sort of do that for us. Yeah, I completely agree. And I personally feel that that's sort of happening now. It maybe wasn't there probably a decade back, or maybe 5 years back, but I sort of see that happening.
No, there's definitely a shift. Like I said, I'm really hoping after what we've been through with COVID, it'll accelerate.
Right.
I think that's the next big step for our community.
Right.
Is that coming together. And, the old adage of we're stronger together,
right,
which can only help us whole in terms of our work environment and our work experience. And let's be honest, at the end of the day, our fees.
Right.
So for me, I'm very, very enthusiastic about the next 12 to 24 months, really, because I do think we're going to see some big changes, and I do think we're going to see and those changes will be good growth changes rather than more of the kind of pre-2020 kind of everybody cutting to the bone.
Right.
Which is only better for the UAE.
And, better for the entire community, generally speaking, I think.
Well, I mean, when I say the UAE, I mean as a society in terms of one of the things I can always remember being told, is what we build today will far outlast us as architects. And do you want to be remembered for the eyesore or the building that nobody wants to live in, or the community that fails on a social aspect and creates an environment where people can't flourish? Or do you want to be remembered for the great work where particular development uplifted a section of people, or kind of contributed to the cultural scene?
Right.
So for me, that's the big modus operandi. It's create things which are gonna empower us as a society, whether it be here in the UAE, in Africa, in Europe. It doesn't matter where you are. You should always leave something better than you found it.
Obviously. Yeah. From the way that you sort of embrace and talk about design, it seems that you have a very sensitive cultural, contextual approach
Definitely.
To whatever projects you do. I mean, clearly so because of, Glenn's and Hopkins and so on, no doubt. However, I guess to some extent, an argument can be made that SSH as a firm in the UAE may or may not necessarily have the sort of time or fee necessary.
It's a balancing act.
Yeah.
That's probably the trickiest thing for me, coming from two practices which were wholeheartedly design-led.
Right.
Creating a new studio. And SSH has been in the region for over half a century.
Right.
Kuwait originally. And the partners took the decision 7 years ago to, expand that into the region. With the scale of operations that we have, our financial situation is very important. We have a lot of people to ensure, are kept safe and are appropriately rewarded for their energy and contribution. So we have to always back that up, and that is very difficult. But that's not to say that for me, as Director of Architecture in SSH, we should ever cut corners.
Right.
And that's when it comes to that balancing act of, advising and giving advice to our clients, that even when we get a very typical developer kind of led project, we have some big projects, kind of from a volume point of view,
right.
is to actually, I don't want to use the word educate, but kind of inform them. There are different ways of doing things which allow us to optimize the process, but create something better. I'll take Creek Beach and Creek Park for EMAR. It's an EMAR project, so everyone knows the product that we're attempting to deliver there. Very high end residential units. But obviously, being developer led, there are massive constraints attached to that. There's EMAR's regulations, there's a brand identity, there's their space identity. There's all of these things that get mixed up, which can make it very constraining to kind of create something that's unique, like we spoke about, or something that's kind of enriching to a community. But there are key little movements on that project that we feel we have made, which actually will, in my humble opinion, probably make it an exemplary community. The first big move that we spent, and we sacrificed part of our program to do this, was when we were awarded the project. There was a very rough prevision of the master plan being on the water, but it was still very much built around the car, built around the road.
Right.
And for me,
the whole pedestrian experience is what's needed.
From a human scale point of view, roads are extremely damaging in a community because they separate. I mean, obviously you need to have that infrastructure there. All communities are built around infrastructure. It's the bones and the muscles of a development. But the way, particularly here in this part of the world, in the GCC, if you look historically, the conurbations where people come together, they're very tightly knitted, tight streets, small courtyards. And that's not just from a social point of view, but it's from a ecological point of view. It gives shade and it funnels wind and all of these things, I think, in many developments are forgotten because the road takes priority. Right. But at Creek, as I said, we sacrificed some of our program time. We had to hit an end date in order to actually develop the master plan to get rid of the car. So there's no road in over 50 buildings coming together, but there's a mass of tight streets, courtyard spaces, strategic F&B retail elements within there, not just plastered all over the place, but strategically placed to encourage people to move at ground level and to interact with one another as a community, but no car. So you take a very, I won't say traditional developer because they're not a traditional developer, they're very forward thinking. You take a developer that has a very strong set of characteristics and a very kind of strong model that they build off. But if you advise them correctly and you work with them, you can still create something that's very unique and special. Right. And that's what is the difficulty, I think, really kind of being SSH and the scale that we are, but not losing touch with adding that honesty, that kind of placemaking or quality of lifestyle element to it. And there's other things in that project which we're very proud of. But that would be the big thing, kind of. So fee-led project, if you wish, but we don't see it as a fee-led project within the design studio. Right. We see it as an opportunity on a grand scale to have a large impact. Right. So that's how we try and handle it. As I said before, and we are not always successful, but we always try to be successful. And I think that's the difference of us, is very much of there's never an acceptance of, we can just do it this way because we've done it before that way. We won't do that. It's something that, it's never uttered or will ever be uttered within the studio.
All right. I think a lot of the listeners would be quite encouraged to hear that there are developers who would be open to sort of that kind of program. I guess because a lot of the listeners are architects and designers themselves, how does one go about that conversation? How do you sort of shepherd your client through that?
Carefully.
Okay.
As I said, we try that on every job and it doesn't always work because sometimes we as the architect, as the designer in the room, just don't put it across the right way. The idea could be perfect, but we don't always, because we're all human at the end of the day, don't always
sort of communicate
that in the most perfect way. Different clients, different approaches. The biggest thing, I think, that's the most important thing across all clients is relationship. It's very old-fashioned, and it's difficult in a community where people do move about a bit more frequently than maybe in other locations. But relationship is the most important thing because if you have a relationship, you generally have trust.
Right.
So that to me is kind of something, unfortunately, you can't just take from the get-go. You have to build up over time and over actual delivery. Right. What we tend to do with a lot of our clients, and we don't have a massive portfolio of clients. I think that's another thing to kind of touch upon is we're quite selective in who we work with. But our clients, since we started 6 years ago, always come back to us. And that's something, that's invaluable. Repeat work
is the best
work. Yeah. Because not only does it show you're doing a good job, but it also shows that relationship is being cemented. Yeah. And it makes it easier every time you go and sit with them and you say, we love your idea, but yes. And it's the but that most clients, they think they hate to hear. But if you have that trust, they'll listen to you. Yeah. And then if you can demonstrate why your idea or your proposal is advantageous to them, that's the killer. Correct. Demonstrating it's not just better to you as an architect, but advantageous to them as well. Correct. Then generally you will be able to explore it and develop it and create something better out of it. But yeah, it's difficult. It's not, there's no silver bullet that's gonna...
Yeah, there's no sort of like, flow chart which you can refer to.
And that as architects, is probably one of those kind of like, we're not educated when we're at university or college, about, I don't think, the importance of our relationships and our kind of interaction skills.
Yeah.
We're very much taught how we design and what all the greats did and our kind of theory of space and, proportion and all of those fundamentals to our profession. But until you get in the real world, the client is just as, if not more important than you are as the architect.
Absolutely.
And, I think that's probably what, as a profession, a lot of us struggle with.
Right.
Because we still see ourselves as the man on the big chair.
Right.
And
all of you must listen to what I say.
Exactly that. It's the old adage of the architect being the most important person.
Right.
It's just not true anymore. It's, we're a part of a bigger thing now, Client is important. We are important. Building services engineer, the structural engineer, interior design, a massive part of it, contractor. You can design the most perfect building, the most spectacular spaces. You can fill it with the greatest program. And if you don't have a relationship with the main contractor in order to deliver what you envisage, then it won't happen.
It's true.
It stays on the paper. And so, I think, kind of for me, relationship with as many great people as possible will always benefit you in this profession or in our kind of industry, in the construction industry, because as one person, you can't do anything.
Right.
But as a team, I refer back to that thing, together we're greater.
Right. I think you touched upon an interesting topic, which I never really realized until just now, which was there is an importance of visual communication for architects to obviously clients, but on the back of it, even when you're sort of preparing drawings for contractors, us architects and designers are normally always guilty of, we can sort of see it in our head.
Yep.
But then, when it comes to an actual drawing, things get sort of lost in translation. And it's interesting because now when I think about it, in architecture school, the only actual time when you sort of convey ideas formally is during a crit, where you're normally being torn apart. So, yeah, you're right. I don't think people actually sort of build on that skill in school.
I think, and again, not to glorify my past masters that taught me, and Glenn and Michael and Simon Fraser and those kind of people. But I think another kind of moments that have been so important in kind of making me who I am today has been very much the time that I spent on site with buildings that we designed. So, I was very fortunate when I was in the UK, I worked on the London Olympics and we designed those for many years. And then when we'd finished that design, tendered it and it was going onto site, we spent time going to the sites and we could see the struggles. You will never have a perfect pack of information. No matter what you do, you'll always want to change something. You'll always want to update it and develop it.
Right.
But, going to site and seeing, the struggles that contractors have interpreting your section or your detail or your AXO or whichever part of the information package that they have really does inform you then of kind of the importance of the work that you do when you're in studio producing those packages, Right. And even more so when I first came out here to do the Miras headquarters, the engineer's office, Miras campus, and then we were on the board for a couple of years doing that. And then we were straight onto site. Hopkins, it's important that handover, going to site as the design architect to become, that construction supervisor, that guardian
of the actual design.
Exactly. And interacting daily with the contractor, and Canseb was one of the best contractors out here, I think. Their understanding of detail and materiality is spectacular. But communicating from a drawing verbally to the man physically, kind of playing in that piece of walnut or dovetailing, the framing for the door frame and,
Correct.
invaluable. And I think as we go forward, kind of one of the things we do with our team here is really try and get them to go to site as much as possible.
Right.
But it's difficult because I think there is a generational thing in that as an architect, you don't go to site. Because as you say, when you're at college or university, that's not taught to you.
Yeah.
Getting dirty and dusty and, kind of trying to explain why that 5 millimeter movement joint is so important that it's expressed on a 10 meter wide long wall because you want that proportion.
Exactly.
If you don't go to site and physically tell the guy that's rendering it, then
I mean, I must be honest. I would like to say that I'm a product, unfortunately, of that sort of school. It's only very recently, over the last 3 to 4 years, that I've actually sort of gone on site, but not gone on site in the sense of, just kind of walking around, but actually understanding why things are happening. A good example would be, I very recently, Mr. Mark Clever, if you're listening, I very recently learned the importance of EPDM layers, which for the longest time, I used to always think that, silicone's enough. But I've recently learned how invaluable they are. Point being, I would have never known that if I'd never gone to site.
Until you see it.
Until I see it, yeah.
It's, we're recording this on the Saturday, and Thursday just gone, I was sat with a couple of my young architects, and we were literally detailing overlaps on the membrane systems.
Right.
And there was one of them was very, very part one, straight from Manchester. Very good architect. Going to be phenomenal. I remember looking at me on Thursday and literally going, why do you know this?
Right.
And the reason I know how that overlaps is exactly the same as yourself. We were doing a raised courtyard on a mansion block in London, and I remember standing with the waterproofers as they were fixing in the mechanical ties and overlapping it and watching them. And I was amazed at the guy, almost origami of the folding of the membranes in order to seal it and that. And then a few weeks later, when they actually did the waterproof testing, when they fill it up before they put anything with water to see if there's leaks, and then suddenly all of it makes sense because you go, right, that's why they need to do it, That's why the 150 mil upstand, making sure you joint it in if there is a mortar bed, putting it in, and all of that suddenly makes sense. You don't know that when you draw it.
Yeah.
But when you see the poor gentleman on site having to construct it, you suddenly go,
that makes a lot of sense.
And that stays with you. Yeah. And so for me, that kind of experience is invaluable. And I think, it adds to the project.
Absolutely.
I'll be honest, from a company point of view, the benefit we see by sending our design architects or studio architects onto sites is that historical decisions that have been made are far easier to explain why they can't be changed. Because let's be honest, contractors will always want to do it the cheapest and easiest way of doing it, which is right as a profession, so long as it's not a detriment to the project.
Correct.
Now, if you're an unfortunate site architect and you have no historical knowledge of why a particular thing was developed in a particular manner, it's very easy to let the contractor just go off and do his thing.
Correct.
But if you're the poor person that spent 3 weeks putting together that package of information and you know every reason for every decision, you're not going to let go of that unless it's the right thing to do. So that crossover for me is very important. And, I think that's another one of those things I really hope going forward we can, as an industry here in the UAE, we can change, and we can not have this segregation between studio architect and site architect. The two should blend. If you're working on site, you need to be in an office. And if you're in an office, you need to be on site.
Absolutely.
It doesn't mean 24/7, but you have to have that visibility. It's an education. It's an extension to your education.
Yeah. And another sort of aspect which is quite interesting, it helps you sort of put packages together in the studio a lot more efficiently.
Exactly that. That's kind of what I was going to lead on to when we're talking about the Creek project. We lost time at the beginning from a remaster planning almost, getting rid of the car. And we did that because we were confident as three disciplines. As SSH, we're a multidisciplinary practice led by architects. I will reaffirm.
People can't see, but I have my fist up in the air.
And but we did it because our director of structures, our director of building services, and myself, we were confident enough that our teams were experienced enough to still maintain the program of delivery and not to move the end date. And we did that through some very clever engineering, separating the facade designs from the GA design, basically, and making sure the MEP was independent enough that it could still be progressed without having to have finalized architectural layouts, so on and so on. So, that only comes about once you've got enough experience in the tank.
Correct.
And enough ways of kind of optimizing your process so that you're not having to spend 3 days researching about gas enclosures or just having it to hand because you've done it before.
Yeah.
Exactly, or someone in the team has done it before. So that to me is invaluable, and it's something I think the industry can. It's the optimization, really. That's what I said before. It doesn't really need massive change. It needs optimization. It just needs to look at things in a slightly different way.
Right. Agreed. I think a lot of people listening would sort of share the same sentiment. But then again, that's sort of, there's a whole, chicken and egg situation, which is where do you sort of stand with young graduates? Because I know SSH.
We have a very young team. We'll be honest about that. It's we run the buddy system, as we call it, which means everybody has a senior,
right?
And it's their responsibility to mentor them,
right? But I guess my question was going to be more of, is there an expectation to sort of understand and expect young graduates to know a certain level of this already?
No.
Okay.
No, I mean, be interesting. You should probably get one of my part 1s or part 2 architects on your show at some point. And
let's hear the truth now.
Yeah, exactly. They'll probably tell you a different story. But very much when I was a part 1, you was a part 1, kind of come straight out of college, you've got zero experience. You think you know the world and you're going to design the next masterpiece, and then you get your first day and you're doing door schedules.
Right.
But so very much when we hire those kind of graduate positions, it's, I'll be honest, we hire for passion, I would say, and for realization.
Right.
And I use that word very specifically because we get a lot of people wanting to come and work with us, and that's great. It's great to see, that people see what we're doing, they like what we're doing, they want to be part of that. But I'll be honest, a lot of the people that we speak to also struggle with the fact of they still have so much more to learn and to develop. I mean, I still every day try and better myself. I read, I talk to people. I'm constantly trying to find new things, or
right.
I get constantly taught by my graduates, kind of things that I don't have a clue about. And you have to have that attitude all the way through your profession. And I think I don't want to beat up the education system, but there is a slight failure in the education system that when students graduate, there's this kind of perception of you're the finished product now.
Right.
And the actual reality is, no, you've got the foundation.
You just sort of started now.
Yeah, you're coming out the ground.
Yeah.
But we still can't see any building.
Right.
You've got a good, solid foundation.
Right.
Now let's create something that's spectacular.
Right.
So passion and that realization to want to continue learning is the two things that we really look for when we're talking to people, having a coffee, as we call it. We don't interview, we have a coffee. Then when they come into the show, like I said, they're very much teamed with a much more senior person.
Right.
People that have experienced what we've been discussing and that. And it's the job of that person and the wider team to then chaperone that person through that process, and after a couple of years, and it's a couple of years, then you start to add value.
Yeah.
But it's not a couple of weeks or a couple of months.
Yeah.
It's a couple of years before you really, you start to earn your keep.
Yeah.
And that's a difficult thing in a world that is driven by, kind of business sense.
Yes.
To explain why such a person is kind of not the right person to go and lead a project, or
right.
You can make more money on that. And
right.
It's But again, that's a responsibility to the profession to educate. Academia is very important, but it's also a way for me. We're a very young studio to leave a legacy, almost. Leave a DNA.
Right.
Of if we can recruit at the graduate level and hopefully bring those guys through so that they become our lead architects going forward.
Right.
Then that's perfect. That to me is the ideal situation. I go back again to Michael's and to Glenn's, and all the partners at both of them studios were people that joined those studios when they were very young.
Right.
And so there is no question of how you do something because it's within them. They are that way of doing it because that's all they've ever known. And that's what we're trying to kind of model ourselves on a little bit here, is very much this idea of longevity and creating something for tomorrow, not trying to get as much out of them today.
Right. Okay. Which, again, super encouraging.
Difficult though, really difficult.
Yeah. Because I was going to ask, that sounds very good on paper.
It's really difficult.
I mean, that's a good, sort of marketing sort of statement to put forward. But
the killer is, as I said, it's difficult as a young person. It's really, I'm still young. I've literally just turned 40. So in our profession, I am a baby still. I get that. And I've been reminded of that many times. But, it's even harder on the younger generations because I purposely try not to interact much in a social media kind of capacity.
Right.
But their generation, they live in that world.
Yeah.
And it's a false world. And they see what a lot of their peers are supposedly doing.
Right.
And they try to aspire to it. And I've had over the years many comments, my friend's got this big house, or they've just got married, or and I can't put the extra hours in because I've got to go on this boat trip, or I've got to do this. And And the reality is those aspirations or those kind of parallels that they're trying to live their life vicariously through aren't real.
Right.
So it's very difficult to kind of keep focus for them. And then that comes down, reality again, down to the people that's mentoring them, to educate them and to help to steer them, but to also know when to push them, when to give them time, when to, we have in the past, taken people off projects to literally just go away and have some time. And, it's difficult on a live project delivery. It's probably even harder now coming out of COVID than it was before COVID. But yeah, it's not easy and it's not always successful. And that kind of becoming a bit of a mantra in a sense, but picking yourself up again, going again, trying again, that's just as important. What I would say is a lot of the people that have come through, and then kind of gone on to other things, I would say most of them have gone on to bigger and better things, which
that's a sign of success.
For me, that shows that their mentors, whoever they were at that time, did a wonderful job because A, they're still in our profession, and B, they've grown and they've gone on to other things. And, and I look at the studio that I left when I was at Howells in the mid 2000s, and everyone around me, my peers at that time, they're now all in extremely senior positions in great practices, or they've, like myself, they've gone abroad and they've started up studios, or they've all gone on to wonderful things. And again, that's something, that it comes because of the way Glenn and his leads taught us and led us and instilled into us kind of that mentality. And if we can do half of what they did, or even a fifth of what they did, then to me, that's a success again.
Right.
Especially because it's even harder in today's world because of that aspirational grab that a generation has.
Correct. Absolutely. A very common sort of misconception, which I get asked all the time from, young graduates or people just coming out of university, there's multiple levels to it, because on the one hand, when you sort of study architecture in a place like Dubai, with the kind of firms that you have here, it's but natural to want to aspire to get into, the Zahas and the Fosters of the region.
Yep.
And rightly so. Why wouldn't you?
Yep.
But a lot of them don't really understand why they want to get there. And I think one of my professors very early on told us that there are some people made for those firms there are some people made for other firms, and there are some people who should never work for any firm and should probably run their own.
Yeah.
And I think the minute you sort of realize that, you'll be a lot more successful in where you want to be.
And far more content.
Exactly.
In yourself.
Exactly. So yeah, that's something which I just try to keep pushing to them, kind of saying, it's fine if you want to get there, but you need to know why you want to get
Precisely
there.
that.
And if you're just going to do it because it seems like the right thing to do, that's normally not going to work out.
Studios are characters in themselves.
Yeah.
And it'd be like a marriage.
Right.
To
some extent, even more than a marriage, I would say.
Potentially, because you probably spend more time in the studio than you do in the marriage. But, in a marriage, you have to have two complementary characters.
Right.
It's exactly that, exactly that of, I honestly don't think until you've done at least a decade, you really know what you want to do.
Right.
Because we work in a profession that's so vast and so the spectrum of work available to you is phenomenal.
Right.
I've been very fortunate in kind of the sectors that I've been permitted and had the opportunity to work in is superb. And that's one of my greatest kind of self-pride things, residential, cultural, sports, kind of master planning. Most things bar medical. I don't like medical buildings.
I don't think most people do.
No, they're far too rigorous and there's far too much responsibility.
Right.
But, until you've got a glimpse at least of all of those different opportunities, you should never say, I want to do this.
Yes.
And pigeonhole yourself.
Right.
Because suddenly, you've closed so many doors on yourself that, it's a waste. I'll be honest, it's a waste of the effort and the time and your skills and your talent. And, but again, it's that thing of being young and fresh out of university. You want something now.
Right.
You put all this energy into getting through college.
This instant gratification sort of thing. Yeah.
And hindsight is a far easier thing to kind of mull on than when you're in that moment. As I said, when I came out of university, I knew nothing and I thought I knew everything. And it took a few years for me to realize, actually, you know what? I'm on a very long road here. And that was probably for me the moment when I started to actually, in line with what you were saying, choose where I wanted to go to be further educated. And, that was Glenn Howells, first of all, for me. That was very specifically targeted as a new, young, up and coming. It was a small studio. We were 20 people, so I knew I wasn't going to get lost in a machine and just end up doing one task repetitiously for a year. I knew I would get the opportunity if I positioned myself appropriately to kind of get involved with all of the different stages, and then moving to Hopkins, the greatest studios out there, but very much so because of his understanding of the fundamentals, detail, materiality and constructability and that whole kind of ethos.
Right.
So again, another very purposeful choice.
Right.
And then the big risk of okay, right, I think I've got enough under the belt. Let's try and create a new studio.
Right.
So very kind of purposely chosen, but not done until I kind of experienced quite a bit and realized I knew nothing and needed a further education. Yeah, the young generations have to do that. And, you're not always going to get it right. And that's not to say you're wrong. Going into, a big studio, a big multidisciplinary firm, or going into a tiny little studio, and not feeling right there, just means that's not the right place for you.
Exactly.
And you're not the right person for them.
Correct.
And that shouldn't be seen as a negative. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's another learning experience. It's another thing to put down and to kind of grow from.
Right.
And when you accept that, you move quicker, I think.
Right.
As you sit and keep trying to fight it, it gets hard for both people then.
Yeah.
That's when it gets tricky.
Right. That's really interesting. Normally in these podcasts, I kind of have in my head the structure of things. I'm like, okay, we should talk about this and this and this. But then I feel like in this particular show, I'm kind of I have so many sort of these like bubble thoughts which are kind of like coming along.
Tangentials.
Yeah. But it just goes to show, I mean, there is so much which if people like us, I mean, not that I would say I'm nowhere near as experienced as you are. And in the grand scheme of things, probably you are also not as experienced as everyone else. So if we sort of come off as, I don't want to say lost, but we're still
precisely
figuring it out.
I still have, my boss, a gentleman called Keith Hill, he's not even an architect, he's a building services engineer.
Right.
Interestingly, did his part one at Bath as an architecture student and then, went across to the dark side.
Right.
But he's my mentor in terms of SSH. And it's been probably over the last 5 years, extremely interesting seeing our profession from the outside.
Right.
Obviously, it's a slightly different relationship. We're both directors and that. But he's been in the region for nearly a quarter of a century. He's seen Dubai come from
nothing
to everything.
Yeah.
So getting his take on the world and interactions and importances is important. And it's every day I take something new, a different way of looking at something, a different way of approaching things. And, every day we have an argument about something where I completely disagree with him and he disagrees with me. But we're big enough and old enough and ugly enough that we accept that as another
opinion.
Yeah. And another thing to grow from, another experience. Norman Foster says it, every day you learn something new. True. And the moment you think you know everything, well, you're done, in my opinion.
Yeah, true. That's kind of when you need to hang up the boots.
Go, retire, sit on the lake, do fishing, whatever turns you on.
Right. I want to pivot a little bit to sort of the management side of things, not so much the design. And I think you would be the right person to sort of answer this question, considering, like you said, SSH is sort of a young studio. For young graduates now that are coming out, a big thing for them is work culture.
Yep.
It's, of course, a big hot topic. Everyone sort of has, their own opinions on it and how it should be done and so on and so forth. But I kind of want to hear it sort of, from the horse's mouth, if you may, from someone like yourself. Is there such a thing that can be even done? And if so, how do you sort of go about creating work culture?
I did a REBA talk during COVID with some great fellow directors, Satiris RMGM, Jenny Binchy.
Right.
Really experienced, far more knowledgeable people than I am. And we all kind of touched upon this from a graduate architect coming into an office and then picking their office. Is every office has a culture.
Yep.
It has a mindset. It's not driven by one person.
Right.
It's driven by the collection of people. And that's very important to understand that because, going into the office, there's going to be a way of doing things that you're going to have to
sort
integrate
of
to and adjust into. But the fact of that it's driven by a number of people, not one person at the top who sits on some lofty throne.
So it's not like a sort of trickle-down effect.
No, I don't think it is. And on this talk, I think it's still on the REBA website. You can probably go back and watch it. We all kind of agreed on it that, even the most inexperienced, youngest person in the office has a responsibility, and I use that word again purposefully, to manage that and to, kind of influence it. So going into an office, first of all, definitely there is such a thing as a culture, but it's not an unsurmountable thing to influence it in the way that you want it to become.
Right.
And we see it here, I look back probably to the team that the first iteration of the SSH UAE team. We were a tiny team and we were probably far more focused on winning work, win work, deliver work. It was very work orientated, and we worked stupendously hard. Whereas I compare that probably to what I call SSH 2.0, the next generation in that short time that's come through, and we're sat here today in our studio, and it's grown. And those new people have brought probably a little bit more funness to the studio, back to where I would remember it being in the UK. So things like, we have a basketball hoop up, and we have a completely separate area where we make coffee and chill out, and little daft things, but things that make it just enjoyable for 10 minutes, that breakaway.
Right.
And then on top of that, something that's new, it was really getting a grip just before COVID, but COVID's kind of knocked it back. But now the team are back pretty much. It's starting to trickle in again, making sure they make time to go out together.
Yes.
But that's not, again, and it shouldn't be, it mustn't be dictated by, as they said, men at the top trickling down.
Right.
That's something that is self-grown, self-seeded. And then they own that and they push it forward. Now, the company supports that, through kind of, bits of petty cash and things like that, to enable it. But it's something that's driven from the team. So it's very much cultural within the team. But I think that comes about because of the characters within the team. They push it themselves. It can't be one man's
sort of driving
vision.
Force.
Yeah. Because if you're a studio of 30, one man doesn't suddenly say, right, we're all going out tonight and we're going to have a great party and you're all going to enjoy yourselves. Yeah. It just doesn't work.
True.
So for me, culture definitely exists. And it's something as a young graduate, you should talk to your friends about and kind of see if you know people that work in that office.
Yeah.
As a profession, you will always hear, studio such thing. They work so hard and they're so determined to get things perfect and da-da-da-da-da. I heard that 20 years ago when I came out, and I heard it 10 years ago when I came out to the UAE. And I don't think those images of practices will ever change, but because of the profession we work in. But the bolt-ons to that, that make it enjoyable, apart from the design, which is obviously... Me personally, that's the most enjoyable thing. But that's driven by the team. That's driven by the people within the team. And if you're in that team, it's your responsibility to get out of it what you want. Make it happen. And that comes down to, as I said earlier when we were looking at people, kind of trying to understand what their passions are and whether they're that type of person, that they're going to push and try and get what they want out of it. It's difficult to make people kind of do things
voluntarily.
Well, I think kind of like if you're a young graduate, it's very difficult for you to come into a studio that's already established and get that studio to say, I don't know, go play bowling once a week or whatever. But if you're a passionate enough person and you believe in what you want, then you can do it.
Right.
But you have to be that type of person. You can't be a very shy person that sits in a corner and doesn't interact.
Right.
You have to be forthright.
Right.
And I think that's something that's important, being forthright is...
For the profession, absolutely. Because, of course, in a studio for that reason, but even if you're in front of a client.
Exactly. It comes back to that whole communication thing. It's... you can communicate why it's important to you and it's important for the team, then it'll happen.
Exactly.
But if you keep it all locked up, it will fester and it will make you very upset.
To put it mildly, yes.
That's one of the things that I kind of learned is very much, if you feel it, just say it.
Yeah. You got to let it kind of went out, exist.
Put it out there. Put it out there. Because the worst thing that will happen is someone will say they completely disagree with you.
Yeah. And that's
then
fine.
What?
And that's fine. Yes. Exactly. Yeah,
At least you now know where you stand.
Right.
I think a lot of graduates could learn a lot from that. I was probably the same when I first came out, worrying of upsetting people and your bosses in particular. And don't put it out there. Put it out there. If it's a great idea, you'll be rewarded for it. If it's not a great idea, on to the next.
Yep, absolutely. And I think if people are professional enough, that's exactly what it'll be. I think the sort of sentiment comes when egos get involved.
Yeah.
And, it's sort of my way or the highway.
Yeah.
Now, again, as a graduate, you need to know what kind of setting you're in. And it's not rocket science. You can sort of, one thing which again comes up in the podcast quite often is that when graduates go for interviews, it shouldn't just be the firm interviewing
You're interviewing the firm.
You're interviewing the firm. So you need to sort of, one of the reasons you should prep is because you want to know if they're a good fit for you, not just the other way around.
There's nothing worse when we're interviewing. It's kind of something I always lead with when I get called into an interview with a newly qualified architect. Is, I will always say to them, right, what do you want to know about us?
Right.
And the worst response for me is nothing. It's like, okay, you know everything about us. What's your favorite project that we've done?
Tell us everything about it.
Yeah. Tell us something. And they don't know. And I get it, I mean, we live in a world now where positions are extremely rare.
Right.
And you just want a job, you want a position and everything. More reason, go and find out as much as you can about that practice and make sure they're right for you.
Right.
Because it is a two-way street. Honestly, it's, as you said before, there are people that are suited to go and work in, the great practices, the great studios, the architects, for the want of a better word. There are those people that should be working in, tiny little boutiques with end clients and, kind of spectacularly personal projects. And, there are people that should be working kind of for contractors or for client side.
Exactly.
So until you do a research about people, you don't get an idea even about what you want to do. So find out about where you're going, find out about the projects they work on at least. If you don't have any interest whatsoever in working on, I don't know, sports stadia, don't go and work for Populous or, if you hate skyscraper buildings, do not apply at SOM.
Right, exactly.
If you love having a defined day, 9 o'clock till 5 o'clock, and, that's very important for your work-life balance, then find a practice that has that ethos, and I've told many people I've worked with, and, there are many practices that do that,
Yep.
They tend to be more of the American corporate entities,
Yep.
but they exist.
Yeah. My first ever practice where I worked, of course, I came in again, all, bright-eyed and, bushy-tailed. And I was all like, practice and finally, first job and everything. And of course, I came a little bit jaded as well, I must say, because I've always heard of, studio life and late hours and everything. And then this first firm I worked for, like 5:30, lights went off, like in the office. And if you stayed beyond 6, you'd actually be reprimanded because they'd figured out that something's wrong. Why aren't you finishing your work?
You're not doing it fast and efficiently enough, or you never understood the task.
Exactly. So, I mean, for me, that was quite strange. I was like, I guess this is how it is. And then shortly after that firm, I guess reality sunk in with everywhere else. But they do exist, is what I mean to say.
And it's about, understanding, and it ties back into what you were saying before about the character of a studio. The ethos, there are times here where we will literally pontificate between ourselves for 2-3 days on trying to resolve a problem. And I'll be honest, very little output occurs. So kind of, you don't really see much for all the effort that's being put in. But then you get that spark. Someone in the team will come up with the idea that just unlocks it.
Right.
And then we go into full overdrive. And then, we're having midnight pizza and we're doing things as a collective that we love. We're sketching, we're model building, we're developing it, we're pushing it forward. It's very much the ethos that happens here. So there's sometimes where you go home at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and you're like, I haven't really done anything today.
Yeah.
But you've been thinking all day. And there's other times, like I say, I leave here and the sun's coming up.
Right.
That's very us.
Yeah.
Now, if you love that creative process and you love that kind of pulling apart and collaborating with other architects and that's great.
Yeah.
But if you're someone, that likes to be in bed by 10 o'clock, we're probably not a good fit.
Exactly. And I think self-awareness is probably a big driving force, which I think a lot of designers need to explore.
Understand your limitation
and your aspirations and your expectations, but they're all very personal, and no one can really kind of. I mean, you can have mentors and all of that, but no one can really tell you what you want, right?
Agreed. I think that comes again, though, just from experience as well.
Right.
As architecture students, everyone's done all-nighters and it's just part of the educational system, rightly or wrongly. But, are you the sort of person that thrives under pressure, or are you the sort of person that crumbles under pressure? That again only comes from experience, I think,
right.
because,
right.
Are you the sort of person that kind of is spectacular in front of a crit? Or are you the sort of person that likes to kind of digitally present, as I call it, you have a fly through or a render package or whatever? Again, only comes through doing it.
Right.
So the more you kind of throw yourself out there, the more you kind of throw yourself open to opportunity to try new things, the more you get to know about yourself.
Right.
I'm very comfortable presenting physically in a room. COVID was not very difficult, but more difficult for me because I feed a lot off the personal interaction with my clients. It's very important for how I kind of approach a project. So doing it over a webcam, there's a very big disconnect for me. But a lot of my team, they thrived under that. It was phenomenal to watch. And so they learned a lot about themselves in that scenario, which for us as a team is great because it adds more strings to our bow. But yeah, kind of learning what makes you tick, learning where your strengths are, learning where your weaknesses are just as important. Yeah, it's invaluable.
All right. For all the young graduates listening, if that has not sort of created a framework as to what you need to do, I don't think anything else will. David, I want to quickly sort of towards the last segment of this show, pivot into an interesting sector, which I think a lot of architects or other guests on the show have not really covered. And I think you would be the best person to, which is sort of the cultural projects. SSH obviously has created,
we'd be very fortunate.
The strongest name for that particular sector in the region. And rightly so. For anyone who's seen the actual work, it's quite obvious that, you definitely know what you're doing there. So for the people, say like myself, who've never done that kind of program before, what's the kind of differences in, say, design approach, or what's the kind of, sort of best foot forward with that kind of program?
Cultural projects are a very unique approach because let's be very honest, cultural projects are generally projects which contribute to defining an image of a city.
True. Very true.
So you have so much responsibility. And they are luxurious projects. They're not necessities.
Right.
And they're generally, for me, they're a moment in time when a city really steps onto the world stage because they can invest in these very kind of one-off moments and contributions. But that means you've got to get them right. So the pressure to get them right is
there's no room for error. Yeah.
And so for us, when we approach, whether it be in QA or in Addis Ababa or, Abu Dhabi and projects that we're working on at the moment, big cultural project, it's invaluable we have the right people as part of the team. Now, for instance, when we're doing the operas and the theatres in Kuwait, it's making sure we had people that had designed some of the best theatre projects in the world. Now, when we say design it, we don't mean from a visual point of view or a space program point of view. We mean, making sure that the back of house works, making sure that, the circulation spaces are correct, making sure that the F&Bs, that program is developed appropriately for the scale of the project. When we worked in Addis Ababa, on the cultural pavilions at Unity Park and that, having somebody on our team that understood each of the tribes that make up the Ethiopian people and had that contextual historical knowledge that made those tribes unique to one another, allowed us then to take that information, that data, and visually represent it in a story within the building form to tell that story.
Right.
And so I think kind of very different to when we do something that's residential or commercial or hospitality, you have to spend as much time as you can understanding your target.
Target being the actual end client, as in the user?
Target being the user,
Okay.
the audience. And also in parallel with that, your subject matter.
Right.
Theatres may be a little bit easier than doing museums and things, in that you can apply a mathematical
sort of equation
to that. Yeah, very similar to when I very first began as an architect. I was doing football stadiums, so sight lines and creating kind of making sure there's no obstructions in the visual line and things like that. Theatres are similar to that, just with a little bit more majesty. But museums definitely, and cultural pavilions and that, you have to put the time in at the beginning. Now that makes it very difficult at the end to then deliver a project correctly. And I think that's probably one of the most difficult things about doing projects like this. But spending that time understanding, pulling apart, researching, visiting the site, talking to the people. There's no other project where you spend that much energy doing that data collection.
Right.
And then during the vision stage, the concept stage, whatever you want to call it, interpreting that. And that then to me comes down to pure creativeness and pure experimentation. We're looking at the moment at how can I describe this without getting myself into trouble? At a theatre project, we'll just say that, but it's hopefully going to be a very renowned theatre project. We've probably got over 100 options on the form and the positioning and all these little tiny things, on that job. And that's not because we can't make our mind up. It's just because what we're trying to do is maximize the opportunity as much as possible.
Right.
And we're trying to make sure that we have explored every avenue possible. Right. And you can't do that if you're doing a tower.
True.
It's not beneficial for anybody.
Yeah.
But when you're creating a landmark, and that's what it is, it's a landmark, usually a cultural building, you have to think about that, because even more so than any other building in a built environment, it's a placeholder.
Right.
And if you look at probably some of the most world's renowned buildings, Bilbao, Guggenheim, they're real place making in terms of you first hearing about that place. I mean, once Gehry had done what he did there, it was world renowned because of that building.
Right.
So making sure you are happy that you have explored everything and you have created something that maximizes the investment from that place into that asset, it becomes quite a weight.
Okay. But then do you think then those programs are scheduled differently as compared to, say, a typical residential development, for example? Because if there's going to be so much...
For sure. I mean, if you take a standard kind of private residential scheme put forward, it's very easy to define what your program will be, from concept through to schematic, detailed design, tender, even construction.
Right.
It's far more difficult with a landmark project, because when you set out, you don't always know what you're going to create.
True.
So how can you program it? How do you know who needs to be involved?
Right.
Some of the great landmarks that have been developed here, they've massively gone over program. That's not a detrimental thing. Yeah. That just shows that they've been done well.
Correct.
Because they've explored all the avenues available to them.
Right.
So from a program point of view, yes, we always put something roughly down, when we're doing it. And yes, we most certainly try our damnedest to maintain that program. But just as much on our side, the client's team as well will also develop their aspirations, develop their understanding. And as time progresses, we live in a very dynamic world. Things change.
Right.
Requirements are modified, If you think about it, I'll use COVID as another thing. If you think about how we design interaction spaces, reception areas, ticketing booths, things like that, how that's going to change going forward, how those spaces, I can guarantee the next projects that we work on, big public assembly buildings, we will be putting so much more area into those front of house spaces.
Right.
Because we'll want that sense of social distancing.
Right.
And down to the little things like bathrooms, we're having conversations with several hoteliers, and operators about how they can actually increase their wash basins.
Right.
And that seems like such an easy thing to do.
Right.
But it's
not
extremely
really,
valuable real estate.
Yeah.
So these tiny little things that need to be incorporated change spaces massively.
Right.
And so you might be 2 years into a design program and suddenly this new requirement pops up from nowhere. There must be around the world many cultural projects going on, and post-COVID, I bet you they're all going back to the design board and having to make some pretty big changes to that, which throws the program completely out again.
Correct.
How you handle it is the tricky thing.
Right. Which, I mean, in all honesty, of course, I don't know the entire life cycle of most of the projects here at SSH, but the end product seems to sort of speak for itself. It's sort of, I mean, when you see it, it seems like it got, like you said, like when you see certain projects, that they've received the attention that they needed. And it seems to be that with SSH, that is the case. So I think it's...
Thank you. I think that's something we kind of really try and push hard for, is the delivery of it. We have a thing that we say to a lot of our new clients when we approach new clients, which is, we're there when we first start sketching and we're there when they hand the keys over.
Right.
And you don't want to be handing the keys over to something that's already fallen apart.
That's true.
So when you have that mindset in your head from the day dot, I think that kind of focuses your attention a little bit to make sure what you're doing, there's no corners cut.
Right.
And if you have that, there's always things that happen that are outside your control. But if you have that mindset, you will invariably give a good product at the end. There are always things in life that throw you off course. It's how you respond to that deviation that kind of defines the outcome for me.
Right. It's interesting. That's a very interesting take. Being there to hand over the keys, I think that's a mindset which a lot of architects don't have. Everyone just thinks of the concept and this is what we're going to do. But not a lot of people actually think about, I need to actually be there for that as well. And that's just as important as the very first one. I think
that's even more important. I keep telling we are probably here in the UAE where we're finishing. We've got 4 towers coming into completion at the end of Q1 this year.
Right.
And they will be the first residential towers that we've handed over. We handed over other buildings, but residential towers, big ones. And there are elements of our team that are still working on those. They're visiting site and they're developing it. And I tell them every time when they have to go to site and they come back and they're hot and they're sweaty because they had to climb up God knows how many flights of stairs or inspect a piece of precast or something,
Right.
It's hard now, but the joy you'll get when you see that building finished and you can take friends into the lobby and you can, or you even just drive by.
Yeah.
That's your building.
It'll definitely put a smile on your face.
It's the best feeling. I still to this day, whenever I drive past Miras HQ, my first building in the UAE, I smile.
Right.
And that was 3.5, 4 years nearly of pain and kind of early mornings, late nights, hard work.
Right.
It's phenomenal. When I look back at the buildings in the UK, the Athletes Village and, kind of the stuff that I did with Glenn's and, it's just, it's that handing over the realization of a sketch to a real building for me that makes it worthwhile what we do.
And I think that attitude actually is, again, something which you can see in the actual product, because I've actually had the privilege of being in that building quite a few times, the Miras HQ, and just simple things like finishing and, detailing and those little, sort of pocket courtyards and things like that. They just elevate the building so much more and you don't even realize it. I mean, I guess for the muggles, the non-designers, I guess they don't realize it. But for a designer, you can see how much that actually makes such a big difference.
It's interesting because the Miras HQ is probably the first building where I've had a lot of friends working it.
Right.
Occupy it.
Right.
And when you get the feedback from a building that someone, because you as the architect, you don't spend time in the building once you've handed it over. You don't see that building
actually operate.
Exactly. Being used. Go and get yourself a couple of dozen people that to go and work in a building.
Who are also designers, most likely.
Oh, yeah. Design construction led.
Yeah.
And then for the rest of your life, you will hear every week about something about that building that you should have done different.
Right.
And it will inform you then. It will inform you. But also as well, they'll tell you the stuff they love, know? The thing about Miras that I constantly get told is possibly the most successful thing on that is the light.
Yeah.
And the way we controlled the lights through the courtyards, it's a big building. It's a ground scraper. There's a lot of GFA in that building, but it sits contextually very delicately. But it also has 4 elevations that allow light to penetrate inside. And it does it very delicately, so it's not blinding.
While still maintaining a lot of privacy. That's also key. Yeah.
And so that's something, which I'll be very honest, the tricks that we have used on subsequent projects, and we've refined them and I think made them better. But, getting that feedback, again, for the juniors, there's nothing better than hearing from people when your buildings are successful.
Right.
When something's gone slightly wrong, it's not your fault, it's the builder's fault.
Of course, always. Well, David, the final question, I think a lot of people initially tend to struggle with, but then they eventually find an answer to it. We ask everyone on the show, which is the utopian situation, which is the perfect storm of the perfect client. I don't want to say unlimited budget, but pretty much how much ever you need, the perfect team behind you, and time which you can devote to it is entirely up to you. Basically, the perfect project.
Yeah.
If that were sort of brought to your desk tomorrow, where someone comes and says, listen, this is what I have, it's entirely up to you. What would be the kind of, I don't want to say program per se, but what would be the kind of areas, even sectors, that you'd want to explore with that kind of team and that kind of utopian situation?
I mean, it's not easy for me to answer, but I do have a very definitive, because it's been something that I've been working on for probably the last 3 or 4 years, which we're still trying to pull off, but we haven't quite yet. I really want to do a transport hub.
Okay.
Our cities at the moment are under this immense change in terms of how we move around them.
Right.
We've had the car now for 100 years, and that has left such an imprint on how our cities are developed, both positively and negatively. But I do really think with the advent of electrical cars, number one, but also with the advent of COVID again, I think the way we use our cities is slightly changing as well. So I think the way we kind of move around is there's going to be a paradigm shift in the next 10 years, I think. And I think, modular automated vehicles are the way forward. I mean, it's interesting. In Sharjah, have you seen the Skytrack that's recently unveiled? And we did a proposal recently in Abu Dhabi as well for something not too far away from that, but also things like with Musk's Hyperloop, and these sort of things where it's these kind of very personal, modular, quick moving,
like pods
and things. And, the possibility of that is phenomenal. You can sort of see those being buried, in the tunnels.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what does that then do? Well, it makes those interchanges monstrously large, because everybody will be coming to a similar point where you have to change. And I think, one of my heroes, Foster, again, he describes the train stations that he was doing in like Berlin and places like that, as the cathedrals of the 20th century. And they really are.
They really
look
really
at them.
Are.
And, that's something that's stuck with me for a very long time about how people interact with them. And I was in London last year, just before lockdown, and, London Bridge, which has been recently redeveloped, is up for the Sterling. I used that station for nearly a decade going through it. What's been done there is spectacular, because they took a very dark Victorian space and they've made it into this very open, well lit. It's still underground, but somehow they penetrate it with light, and they've made it very easy to find your way around. Very simple architecture. So for me, a big transport hub, but in a modern sense. So from a team point of view, I would want to work with some, kind of very forward-thinking people again, and clients. There's clients that come to you. You said it, I think, in the description of the question was, kind of clients that don't have an idea already. And that's not to say I already have an idea, but they will give you the space to
figure it out,
to explore. But a client that wants to come along for the ride.
Yeah,
and that's really important as well. A client that I can interact with, client that gives constructive as well as positive feedback, but a client that knows what his end target is. That's important.
Right.
What does he want to get out at the end? What's the what's the outcome that he wants to get. Doesn't know what the outcome is, but he wants to know what the outcome should be.
Right.
And off the back of that, you'd have to build a team as well of engineers and like-minded specialists. I love working with people that kind of work in our industry without even realizing they work in our industry. I always remember back in 2007, 2008, I think it was, when we were working on the Athletes Village at that time, and there was a company that came out of Arabs, and they literally it's normal stuff now, but they'd worked out how you could particle envision movement of mass people.
Oh, cool.
And so phenomenal algorithms and everything. And now it's just every day when you do people movement and everything. But at that time, it's like, wow, these people exist. I love coming across people that just have these very small little ideas that are so important in the grand scheme of things. And they're so focused on one thing.
Yep.
So I would try and incorporate as many of those people into the team as possible. But yeah, that to me would be the best project. And a transport hub that then allowed us to re-envisage our cities and make them far more pedestrian and human and less disconnected. That to me would be the lifetime project, because you would want to spend forever just kind of developing and exploring.
True. Absolutely. I mean, if there was something which you had to spend a lifetime on, that's definitely it, right? I mean,
yeah, I mean, it's probably, it's that kind of real in-between space between urban design, master planning and architecture for me, but it's real placemaking. And, I hark back to, the cities that kind of probably when I was a student that I loved visiting, kind of New York and Paris, and Rouen, strangely a tiny little city, but they're walkable. And I think the greatest cities in the world are walkable. And when you walk places, I've been to New York more times than I can count. I've never took the subway once because I just find myself wandering.
I think most architects who've been to New York have the exact similar experience.
And London's the same. I kind of, you spend so much time in London, but I go back now and I still find new places because I'll just wander off and find a little coffee shop or a pub on a corner, or you'll find something that you've never seen before, and yet you've walked down the street 10 times.
Right.
And so if we could do something like that in the UAE and start connecting our cities by breaking the highways down,
right,
I think that's only positive.
Yeah. And I think one of the biggest sort of walls that people hit is they always say, oh, but the weather. And I think that's not really a factor, is it?
No, not at all. I mean, it's quite a nice full circle, really. But you go back to kind of what we're doing up at the creek and what Hopkins did at Gate Village. The Gate Village for me kind of harks very much back to what happened up by the creek, Old Town.
Yep.
You look at the architecture in this part of the world. Well, there wasn't a car 100 years ago, and people had great lives.
Right.
They just designed for their environment.
Yep.
And my kind of issue with the internationalism that kind of happens around the world, where cities all are starting to look a bit the same, is they're not contextual.
Right.
And that's one of the big problems that we have in the UAE is our cities aren't contextual. We have, 6-lane highways cutting through urban districts, and you're like, why?
Right.
We fixed the master plan a couple of years ago, and the infrastructure. There'd been some great architects on it before from America. Right, kind of should tell you something. They didn't live here, so they didn't understand, and they put straight down the center of the site 4 lanes of traffic. You had a water's edge on one side, and you had a park on the other side. And
one's ever going to cross.
No one's going to walk 4 lanes. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
So we probably spent 2 months undoing this road, putting extra exits in, and kind of calming measures. And the volume of people needed the traffic, but you have to look at things in terms of people moving around. And if you put a highway straight through the middle of something, they won't cross it. Most people won't cross 2 lanes of traffic.
Right.
So we have to find ways that are better. The ranches is really interesting. Probably one of the oldest communities
here, yeah.
And apart from the main parallel road of the 311, that's the only real area the cars are. The rest of the place is very bicycle driven.
Right.
And so you kind of go, well, that's in Dubai. Right. Why can't that be in downtown? Why can't that be in Business Bay? Why can't that be? Why can't it be everywhere? And it can. That's the question. Yeah. What we have to do is just be a little bit more sensitive to the areas around the plots that we develop and stop thinking about just that's my plot in the affection plan and everything beyond that
is arbitrary. Yeah.
Once you start to stitch these things together and create the spaces and then question the master plan, push the road highway people, say to the infrastructure boy, why do you really need that much room? Like, you don't need that much room. We don't do this anywhere else.
Right.
Design it better.
Right.
Come back to me with another option. Work with him. Sit with him. Then we'll take the next step on. We have great foundations here. We just need to next step. Once we do that, I think we'll be in a really spectacularly unique place.
Awesome.
Cool.
I am really inspired, I must say.
Thank you.
As I tend to be with, this is not our first time sort of doing this. And that's mainly my fault. For those of you who know, you know. But again, David, thank you so much for being on the show. Our conversations tend to normally be a lot more bigger picture to the profession as compared to, sort of project specific.
Yeah.
And I think that that's brilliant. And I think that these are the conversations which a lot of designers need to start having with each other, as we touched upon earlier, kind of sharing this information.
Agreed.
And we look forward to having you on the show, obviously, a lot more. And from us and the entire team, thank you so much for being on.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And happily come and sit and have a coffee and chat with you anytime. It's been great. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you. And we will see you guys next week. Fellow A-formers, thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for being part of our journey. And thank you for the immense support we've been receiving for our episodes. It has and continues to be a very bumpy road, but we wouldn't want it any other way. If you enjoyed this episode and it brought you value, please share this episode with anyone who may benefit from it. But of course, if you loved the episode, follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn, send us a little DM, and we may just send you a secret link to a secret episode which we've been working on. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. See you next time. Keep sketching.